Welcome and thank you for joining us for this Flinders University Meet the Minds. And we've got a really interesting presentation today on the politics of outer space. I'm Professor Jerry Redmond. I'm the Dean Research at the College of Business, Government and Law. And I'm excited to be hosting today's event as we explore space age issues and how to govern this strategic environment. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Kaurna people on which we stand, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, this event is delivered as part of our Meet the Minds series, where you're going to meet some of Flinders University's most engaging minds as they bring you the latest research from a diverse range of fields. And today, we are fortunate to be hearing from Associate Professor Rodrigo Praino, who is from the College of Business, Government and Law here in Flinders University. He holds a PhD in political science and has received several prestigious fellowships, scholarships and awards, including a Fulbright scholarship and funding from the Australian Research Council. In 2018, he became the first political science scientist to win a Tall Poppy Science Award for excellence in scientific research and communication. As always, we're keen to make this interactive event as friendly and interesting as possible. It's your chance to participate in the discussion and to pose questions to speakers in real time. We do ask, however, that everyone treats this forum as a place of respectful engagement where people are treated with dignity and where differing views are tolerated. So now we're ready to start receiving questions via the message function on this platform. And now it is my pleasure to invite Associate Professor Rodrigo Praino to start the presentation.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jerry, and thanks to all the team that organizes and manages this event. I'm very happy to be here and be able to showcase my research. As Jerry mentioned a second ago, the title of the presentation today is The Politics of Outer Space, and that is work that I've been doing here at Flinders University, in part financed by the Australian Department of Defence through a strategic policy grant that I was the winner of in 2020. So space matters. Space is hugely important to our lives. Space is hugely important to everything that we do, to a number of activities that we do. And of course, some of the applications of space technology in our daily lives are fairly clear. So for example, when you talk about GPS navigation, we know we call it satellite navigation, right? We see it in our cars, we see it in our phones, and we realize that often that comes from satellite technology, but there is a lot of it that is not that direct, that the connection is not that direct, and yet space technology is out there and it is influencing a number of things that we do. In fact, I would go as far as saying that today, space and space activities is a transversal aspect of our everyday life. As someone who engages with this type of question, this type of issue on a daily basis, I have learned the amazing things that are done through the use of space technology. So for instance, here in Australia, we use space assets, or we should use space assets to track bushfire dangers. Countries have used it to do emergency management. They have used it, so floods and natural disasters and other things that require attention. We use it for telecommunications, of course. We use it for navigation. But we use it in more specific ways. So for example, another important thing in the Indian Ocean is to check and control piracy activity. So there's a lot of things that happen with the use of space technology that we don't directly think immediately this is possible because we have assets in outer space. but it is becoming more and more relevant, more and more prominent, more and more important. Now, when it comes to states and how they engage with space and with the space assets that they own and operate, we start talking about space powers. Some countries are clear space powers. When you say space, most people think immediately NASA. NASA is the National Space Agency of the United States of America. We know the United States is a space power. It has been for a while. There is no way to confute, and there's no need to try to contest this. Same thing happens with Russia. When you think space race, we're thinking, you think Cold War, you think about the Sputnik. Russia, was the first nation to be able to put to orbit, in outer space. That was a great achievement. And then, they engaged in that massive space race with the United States that culminated in the U.S. landing in the moon. So we know that the United States and the Soviet Union were space powers. The U.S. still is. Russia inherited the vast majority of the infrastructure of the Soviet Union in terms of space technology and power. So Russia is still today a space power. And then there is China. China is definitely a rising space power. They have engaged in space much more than any other country except for the United States and Russia. They are both, their technical capabilities and also the way they integrate space in their daily operations has been increasing. Most people would not recognize the logo of the Chinese National Space Agency, but China is becoming a relevant space power every single day. Becomes more important and more powerful in that sector. But there are also other countries that engage with space. Many of them engage in a relevant way, and many of them engage in an important way. But we don't really think of these countries immediately when we say space. So, for example, Japan, India, but also Australia. They aspire to be space powers. They're engaging with space. They are players in that area. But how exactly do we interpret their activity? Are they powerful? How can they become more powerful? Can they compete with the major space powers? How does a country become a space power? There are many questions that are currently unanswered when it comes to the engagement of multiple countries in the space arena. Some countries even thought it was a good idea to bound together and create a space agency that is supranational. So, for example, European countries have done so in form of the European Space Agency to sort of like pool resources and try to create something bigger than what exactly the one country could achieve. So there are many questions, as I said a second ago, that still remain unanswered. So the first one, and almost surprisingly, there is very little consensus in the existing literature about this. What exactly is a space power? What makes a country a space power? Is possessing the technology enough? Is using the technology in a certain way? What we're actually looking at, what exactly is a space power and how do we define a space power? Second, how can we differentiate space powers from lesser space actors? Again, we know that the United States is the most important space power that exists nowadays. We know that Russia and China are sort of like in that ballpark area, but how about all the other countries? Where do they sit? How can we differentiate between them? And what should we look at in terms of technology, activity, etc., in order to be able to sort of put them in a scale? And finally, how can a country become a space power? What makes a country more or less powerful in the space arena? What activities should a country engage in order to increase their ability to engage into that space arena? That's where the project that I am currently working with comes at. We call it Measuring Space Power. In order to engage with these questions and in order to measure space power in a number of countries, I founded here at Flinders University SPARC, the Space Power and Policy Applied Research Consortium, which is a consortium between a number of researchers that work at different institutions, including Flinders University, but also, for example, the European Space Policy Institute in Vienna, Austria, that engages with questions that relate to space power. And together we're trying to find a solution and an answer to this question that is currently unanswered in literature. How do you measure space power? How do you become a space power? What is the difference between space actors? And so if you'd like to see more about what we're doing, you can visit our website, which is sites.flinders.edu.au /SPARC, SPPARC /. Now, current efforts to measure space power tend to focus predominantly on space capacity. What do I mean by that? Capacity in this sense is essentially the technology that is available to a specific nation state, to a specific country. Most of these works that try to measure, that talk about measuring space power, all they do is essentially count satellites. They go out there, they see how many satellites does country A have in orbit, how many satellites does country B has in orbit, and they say, well, the more satellites you have in orbit, the more powerful you are. Now, this is part of it, right? Of course, if you cannot be a space power if you don't have satellites. You cannot be a sports car racer if you don't have a car. That's obvious. Of course, having space assets and possessing and operating satellites is important and relevant, but it cannot be the entire story. Right? It's not only about possessing these assets. It's not only about being able to operate them. It is much more than that. And so we do think that essentially counting satellites or anything that resembles that type of activity is a little bit misleading. It's definitely incomplete, and ultimately it's not very helpful. Because there is so much more that we can and should be doing in order to understand, to measure and to understand the level of power in space of different countries. Now, a lot of this work that I'm doing in collaboration with a number of people, including Marco Liberto and Matteo Capella, who are the main authors of this book that came out in 2019, end of 2019. And it's called Measuring Space Power, a theoretical and empirical investigation on Europe. This was, it's a framework that was developed by Aliberto and Capella and applied to the European context. It was published by Springer, but sponsored also by the European Space Policy Institute. So in there they start to develop this framework, and they start telling us that capacity is only one side of the story. There is more to it, and they start talking about autonomy. So the interaction between capacity and autonomy is what determines what a space power is. So we start from this publication, and we develop that into a much more complex framework in order to go out there and measure not only the space power of Europe, but the space power of all relevant countries in the world. Now, this is how our framework works. In one side, you've got capacity. Capacity is, as I said, an important part of the story. And we think capacity should be divided in two different sections: hard capacity and soft capacity. Hard capacity is essentially counting not only satellites, but space assets in general. So we go out there and we go say, okay, this country has some space capability. In order for you to engage with space, you need some technology. So it's a matter of counting and understanding exactly what is your infrastructure, right? What do you have in terms of space assets and space technology? We look at the full spectrum of activities. I'm not going to get into specific details, but we look, yes, we count satellites, but we also count other things and other technology, including land technology that you need in order to engage with these assets that ultimately end up in space. So hard capacity is part of the story, but it's only one part of the story. Then we start looking at something that we call soft capacity. Now, soft capacity is a little bit trickier to analyze and to understand and to measure, because soft capacity, the way we think about soft capacity is how you use the technology that you've got and how you integrate that with other areas of activity. So yes, it's great to possess technology and possess assets, but we need to understand exactly how are these assets integrated in other areas of activity, including, for example, agriculture, the economy, finance, telecommunications, global positioning, environment protection, disaster management. How well integrated with, the space infrastructure all of these areas are. So we go out and we go measure this. Now, measuring this is a little bit more difficult. So we do that through a survey, through an expert survey. We recruited a number of people that are experts in space activities of all of the countries that we are analyzing. There's 11 countries that we selected to start our analysis with. We go out there and we interview experts in each one of these countries, multiple experts actually in each one of these countries, of course, and we come up with an index of how well integrated the space technology available to that country is in other areas of the activity. Now, this is one half of the story. Right? It's already, as you can see, it's already much more difficult and complex than simply measuring, counting number of satellites a country has. But this is only half of the story, because there's another half, and it's the autonomy half. Now, when it comes to autonomy instead, we're looking at whether or not a country is able to engage with space by itself. Remember, there are three major players: the United States, Russia, and China. Now, one thing is for you to engage with space with your own technology and in your own political terms. Another thing is for you to engage in space because one of the three major actors allow you to engage with space by selling you technology that you're not able to produce, by allowing you to use launchers and other types of facilities and technology that you don't possess. Because if you are engaging with space, thanks to the benevolence of one of the three large space powers, are you a space power on your own right, or are you just some sort of derivative type of actor that is allowed to play with space because you've got someone sponsoring your activity? So it's a very different story, and it's a dimension that hasn't been addressed up to now. Again, autonomy is also divided into technical and political. Technical autonomy is essentially your technical ability to go to space, right? So it's not only owning space infrastructure, it's not only owning the assets. Are you able to produce, manufacture, and launch that asset into space? The truth is that most countries are not. And this is what the majority of space actors fail, because launching is one of the most difficult things. Producing all of it or most of it, or sometimes you purchase things, of course, but being able to produce all of it if you wanted to is also another area where most countries fall short and then are not fully autonomous. And then once we address technical autonomy, we can talk about political autonomy. Political autonomy is also a little bit more immaterial, in the sense of it's the ability of a country to formulate their own interests and to define their own space policies and goals. So what I mean by that is that, are you as a country able to set your own goals in space regardless of others, right? Of course, no state and no actor in pretty much any realm of human activity acts regardless of others, but it's the idea of would you be able to do that if you wanted to? Would you be able to engage with space autonomously, or do you also have to take into account what other countries are allowing you to do or happy for you to do, or et cetera, et cetera. So it's also a measure that is a bit more complicated. Technical autonomy, we can go, and of course, some of this is classified, so we of course don't have access to everything that happens in space. But we can get a very good sense of hard capacity and technical autonomy just by going out there, measuring things, and looking at technology that is available and exists. I told you soft capacity we gathered through a survey. The same survey we used in order to gauge political autonomy and get some sort of evaluation of whether or not experts in space in specific countries believe that their country is autonomous in political terms. Now, there is an enormous amount of activity, of information that we gathered in order to come up with these scores, and we use a cascading method. We start looking at 105 different units. So we have 105 different pieces of information that we start with, that then we aggregate into area scores, macro area scores, sub-dimension scores, dimension scores, and we finally get into the space power index. So when we come up with the space power, and I'll show you what it looks like in just a second, but when we come up with a space power index, you need to remember that we are coming with that number starting with 105 different pieces of information. So it's a massive amount of information that gets aggregated and rationalized in order to come up with something that is spatially easy for us to understand. And the ultimate consequence is intersecting capacity and autonomy to find one individual point in this two-dimensional space, where, of course, moving in this direction, it's states that are more capable, they have higher levels of capacity, so both hard and soft capacity. And moving across this axis instead, you are talking about increasing autonomy, both technical and political. So according to where a country ends up positioned in this plane, we can talk about limited space nations. There is a nation that has low capacity and low autonomy, probably engages very little or not at all in space, and if they do so, they only do using other countries' technologies, and they're not autonomous at all. So, for example, a nation that purchases one satellite from China and sort of like operates it or uses their or utilize Chinese technology to operate it, would be located somewhere over here. All the way in the other extreme, we have the space power. So it's countries that have high capacity and high autonomy. In many ways, these two extremes are not very interesting because we know which countries are going to end up here, right? We know that the United States is going to be somewhere here. Russia and China are going to be close by. We know countries that are going to be here, countries that have no space activity. What we don't know and really understand is this large gray area. And we chose two different tones of gray in order to differentiate, because you could have, autonomous spacefaring nations that have limited capacity but significant autonomy, and capable spacefaring nations that have significant capacity and limited autonomy. This here is where the majority of countries are going to end up. So it's going to be, Australia, probably the European Union as well by the time we're done. It's not going to make it over there. So the European Space Agency, Europe is going to end up, because, European Space Agency, European are different things and different members as well. So let's say Europe will end up somewhere here, as well as will India and Japan and Norway and other countries that do engage with space. And the important thing and the most interesting outcome of our research will be to be able to advise these nations on what they should work in how they should invest their resources and their time and their efforts in order to sort of like grow and rise into this area of like a space. If you want to be a space power, some countries will have to work in the autonomy area. Some countries will have to work in the capacity side, and we will be able to go in the nitty gritty. By looking at the scores that produce our final unit, will be able to advise. You should really invest in this area in order to move ahead and to improve your current circumstances. Now, hard capacity and technical autonomy. So this here shows that more than 3,800 spacecrafts were successfully launched between 2011 and 2020. Now look at the how interesting the graph is, because it differentiates from country to country between operated and owned and manufactured. So that this piece of information is giving you some food for thought in both dimensions, the hard capacity and the technical autonomy. So the first thing that you see here, and this is the kind of data that we are collecting, this is just one piece out of the 105 different units that we have gathered. So what you can see here, for example, is that the number of spacecrafts that were launched by the United States is significantly higher than all other countries. Now, there are things that we need to talk about, because some of these are microsatellites, and so there's a number of very small units that are launched altogether. We have to count them one by one. So there is a catch. It's not quite as bad as it looks, but the U.S. launches significantly more assets in outer space than all other countries. Now, if you start looking at what happens in terms not only of the difference between launches, but the difference between the ones that are actually manufactured, you start seeing that some countries have very little manufacturing capability. Even some have essentially none, and then it starts growing. So it's two different data points, and they are conceptually different, and this is why we consider them in two different divergent and separate ways, the hard capacity and the technical autonomy sides. This is the same. These are the number of successful launches between 2011 and 2020. It's the same data presented in two different ways. Same thing. You can see the U.S. has an enormous number of launches, but when you start looking at that, it starts becoming a little bit closer, right? You see the difference between the three large space powers and all of the others. Europe is not quite at that level. It's still much higher than everybody else. Again, you're pooling the resources of a number of countries, and they are mostly wealthy countries. But even so, they don't quite compete with the United States. They don't quite compete with the United States at the level that the United States, China, and Russia. Again, another one of those 105 pieces of information that we've got. This is the total satellite mass successfully launched between 2011 and 2020. And the reason why we look at this is to try to account for those tiny little microsatellites that get sent nowadays, that are very small, and that you can't really compare in terms of the effort that requires to produce and send up to space, something that weighs several tons versus, some of these satellites are really, really small. So here you can see that there is, the United States, Russia, and China. It's a little bit more even than that first massive lead that the U.S. Got in the first picture. So all these things have to be taken into account, because they are pieces of a larger puzzle, right? They fit together, and they have a different level of influence, and they play a slightly different role. So we have to consider all of these things. And as I said, we have 105 different information points that we start with in order to come up with the final score. Now, as I said, we have chosen 11 countries to start our analysis, and we are of course looking into Australia, but we're also looking into Brazil, Canada, China, Europe. As I said, European Union plus the United Kingdom because they're still cooperating in the space agency. So Europe includes both of these. India, Israel, Japan, Russia, South Korea, and United States. So of course the three large powers, Europe, and plus the ones that we think are the most relevant emerging space powers that are trying to they aspire to become a space power, but they're probably not quite at that level yet. And this is the most interesting part of it. You know, we know that Russia, the United States, and China are going to end up right up into the space power corner. We want to see how the other countries compare and how we can advise them and in terms of investment and effort in order to improve their activities in space. Now, this is something that I asked my team to produce just to show during this presentation. I need to. We had a big fight about this. They did not want me to start showing off this picture because it is preliminary data. It's not completed. We haven't finished the analysis yet. We have done the majority of it, so I feel like this is good enough for me to start showing. It's not final. There will be a few things that are going to be different in our final version. So please take this for what it is. Big warning, preliminary data. We're talking about it, but it's not finished yet. You can see what we are getting at, right? So this here is just the capacity submatrix. So we're looking at hard capacity and soft capacity. It's not yet capacity and autonomy put together, so we're just looking at the positioning of these countries in terms of capacity. And look what happens. United States and China all the way up there. Russia, close enough, right, to the very edge. Europe is a bit further down, so a bit less capable than these others and a bit less autonomous than all of them. And here you can see also what happens with the others. The others are kind of like in the center, right? And the issue here seems to be mostly hard capacity. For example, when we look at Australia, right? And this is the interesting bit of this research because this is where we can actually use this information in order to try to influence policy decisions. When it comes to Australia, look what happens. Australia seems to be very, very, very capable in terms of soft capacity. Like we're a match for the Europeans. We're actually scoring in here slightly higher than the Europeans, and matching with Russia because what we've got is well integrated. So we are using well the assets we have. Our issue is hard capacity. So probably what we should do is boost our hard capacity in order to match the level of integration that we are able to achieve. So essentially what it tells you is that what we have we are using very well, we just don't have enough, if it makes sense. So again, preliminary data, but this is the kind of reasoning that we will be able to do once the research is concluded and once I have the final data on all of this. Again, as I said, in order to come up with this is, as I told you, is just half of the story. So it's just a capacity matrix. But even to get in here, we don't use all 105 units, but it is a very, very, very complex process of getting all that information and transforming it in a score that we can put into a plane. Thank you very much for your time here.
Thank you, Associate Professor Prino. Very interesting presentation. We do have some questions now from the audience. First one, very obvious from your last slide there. Is Australia on the way to becoming a capable spacefaring nation?
Well, definitely. So Australia has gone a long way. Australia has a very interesting history in terms of space engagement because we were one of the first nations to sort of engage heavily with space, right? And then there is a period of time that Australia simply stopped doing it, right? So there is this massive sort of hole in our space engagement history where space wasn't at the forefront. But now, with the creation of the Australian Space Agency, that actually is based here in Adelaide, for those of you who don't know it, is it signals a massive shift, I think, in the way Australia is thinking about space. We're thinking about space, we're thinking about space technology. There's a lot of calls for investment in that area. So I think Australia is in a very good position in order to increase its relevance and presence in space. There is a lot of work to do, as my preliminary data shows. There's a lot of work to do, but I think that the good news is that it seems that, as I said, what we have is well used. It's just a matter of doing more of what we are doing, which in some ways it's easier, right? It's not about changing the way that we engage with space. It's just trying to engage more with space.
Right. And you mentioned that Adelaide is where the Australian Space Agency is based.
Mm-hmm.
How involved is South Australia in the space sector more generally?
I think South Australia is a leading state in the space sector. It's a leading state in terms, of course, we host the Federal Space Agency, but there is a lot of attention, a lot of interest from state government in the space sector. There's a lot of investment coming up. There is a strategic document that came out last year that talks about all of the things that the state government is doing. So South Australia is very well placed. It is in the priorities. We organized here at Flinders one of our policy network forum last year with the Department of Premier and Cabinet on space engagement. So there is a lot of attention and a lot of the state government seems to be very interested in boosting the presence of space and the role that South Australia plays into that. So I think that's an exciting moment for not only for Australia, but for South Australia in particular.
Right. And one final question. We're hearing a lot now about private entrepreneurs building space rockets and launching them into space. I think the most recent one was Jeff Bezos, who was selling seats on his plane for millions of dollars, right? How important are these private entrepreneurs in building space? And are there any in Australia?
There's a lot of private companies that engage with space, right? A lot of it is private. I would say that one, if not the major focus, a very strong focus of the Australian engagement in space is with private enterprise. Now, it's both an opportunity and a risk, right? It's an opportunity because it boosts the ability that a country has to engage with space. It brings investment. It brings, probably leaps in terms of technological advancement. It brings interest. Just we're talking about Bezos, where people talk about, now I forgot his name, of course, but Tesla.
Elon Musk.
Engage. How can I forget that? I did. Engaging with space and all of his the SpaceX, etc. So it creates that sort of it rebuilds interest. If you think about it, many years ago, little kids were really interested in space. Right? It was every little child wanted to be an astronaut. And then it sort of died out, didn't it? It became less and less relevant and important. And so by having all of this engagement, it becomes fresh in people's minds, fresh. The interest in society grows as well. So it is an opportunity. It is also a risk. And this is part of what my group wants to do in the future is actually look into the interaction between public and private enterprise and how they engage with space and what this relationship between the two causes and how should the state act to regulate and curb private activities in space. Because you can't just go up there and do anything you want. right? There have to be very, very serious regulations and policies in place in order to regulate the activity. And also, what does it mean for some of these corporations are multinational? So then, you act in one place, use technology from one place into the other, then you go to a third country and you launch it in a fourth country is operating. Like, it becomes really complicated and messy. In fact, my group Spark is sponsoring a panel at the CPR European Consortium for Political Research. There's a huge conference that is happening in September, and we're sponsoring a whole panel in there. And one of the papers from one of the people in my team is exactly about this. It's about the interaction between public and private. So it's something that we are very interested in. I don't have an answer for you, I'm sorry. But it's something that we are engaging with, and I think it's going to be a large portion of the conversation in the next 10 to 20 years.
Thank you very much. Well, you heard it here first. Big expansion in space, big expansion in South Australian space industry. I'd like to thank Associate Professor Rodrigo Prino for his presentation, a really interesting presentation. I'd like to thank you for tuning in and listening. And remember, you can watch this session again or any of the other Meet the Minds sessions on the Flinders Meet the Minds webpage or on YouTube. And you can also register to receive notifications for future events. And thank you once again, and have a good day.